Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yes, I think it works. All right. So welcome to today's event here at the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. My name is Sayuri Romei. I'm the Associate Director of Programs at the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation here in Washington, D.C. And I'm thrilled to serve as moderator for today's event titled Eurasia from the East, Japanese Views. Our four wonderful panelists will offer perspectives about Russia from a Japanese point of view, as all four of them come from the Slavic Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University in Japan. And since Russia invaded Ukraine this past February, here in Washington, we have heard a lot of commentary and a lot of discussion about the war, but mostly from a Western point of view, from Europe, from America, essentially from DC. So today I'm really excited that we're going to explore a very different point of view and how today's Russia is seen from Japan to China to Saudi Arabia even. I think our panelists are uniquely positioned to do that as they're based in Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, which definitely feels Russia's proximity in a much tangible way, I would say. So before we jump into introducing the panelists, I'd like to note that today's event is co-sponsored by the Kennan Institute, the Asia Program, and the History and Public Policy Program, as well as the Slavic Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University, of course. And for our virtual attendees, if you'd like to ask our speakers any question during the conversation, you can submit it. You can submit your question via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter @Kennan Institute or on the Kennan Institute's Facebook page. You can do that at any time. And please remember to include your name and affiliation when sending your questions. All right, so let me briefly introduce all the panelists. So first of all, we have Dr. Akihiro Iwashita. He's a professor at the Slavic Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University. He teaches courses on border studies, Russian foreign policy, and Eurasian international relations. And his research focuses on the development of the Russian economy, and he emphasizes macroeconomic growth and structural changes, as well as the Russian Far East and Japanese-Russian relations. And he has degrees from Kyushu University and Kitakyushu University. So I know that this is not the first time that he speaks at the Wilson Center. He's been engaged with the Kennan Institute for quite some time, so welcome back. Yeah. And then secondly, we have Dr. Tabata, Shinichiro Tabata. He is the professor at the Slavic Eurasian Research Center, also at Hokkaido University. He also works as a professor at the Arctic Research Center there at the same university. He specializes in economies of Russia, its far eastern and Arctic areas. And he has conducted a lot of statistical analysis on these economies. One of his latest publications, I can quote, is Russia's Far North, the Contested Energy Frontier, or the one from this year, actually, a note on the growing international reserves of Russia in the Eurasian geography and economics. We also have, as a third speaker, Dr. Norihiro Naganawa. He is professor of Central Eurasian Studies at the Slavic and Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University. And he also has an appointment at the Research Institute for Languages and Cultures of Asia and Africa at Tokyo University of Foreign Affairs. And he has received many awards, and his work has appeared in Slavic Review, Critica, Ab Imperio, State and Society, And his book, Islamic Russia, Empire, Religion, and Public Sphere, has received the 2019 Mishima Kayun Memorial Award. So welcome. And then last but not least, right here, I hope you can see, we have Dr. David Wolf. He is the Director Emeritus of the Cold War International History Project here at the Wilson Center. He is also a former Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow in Japan. He has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Berkeley, and the University of Chicago. And he has co-edited several trans-Pacific collections and is now writing on Stalin's Far East policy after World War II. Excited to read that. And he has degrees from Harvard and Berkeley. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to ask the first question to Dr. Uesta. What is your assessment of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? How does this change the whole international and regional landscape in international relations? And what is this big picture view of the implication of the war now that we're entering the 9th month of the war? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for inviting us here in a real face-to-face talks. This time we should have discussed seriously the impact of Russian invasion of Ukraine, not only Japan, US, and all over the world. As far as I understand, many people discussed the strategic sense of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, but I feel not so deep analysis anywhere. So I try to have a big mouth for the look at the long impact of this issue first, then implication for Northeast Asia, particularly Japan. So the big title, Second Ice Age. So of course we can call it a second Cold War, but many people say that Cold War again. We forget nature of the Cold War. But the important thing is that these 3 years at the end of the Soviet Union and up to this year, 30 years, this is a very good years, happy years. But happy years ended. So this is the truth I want to say. Therefore, the second ice age, first, if I call first ice age as the first Cold War, the second ice age, it means that between 2 ice ages, happy 30 years, we call it post-Cold War. But term of post-Cold War ended. This is my first thesis. Then I call it integration period. So why this kind of discussion is necessary? So Russia as a fundamental challenger to the world order. Even now, many countries, including Russia, have just interest-based stakes, holders, something like business. I don't think at all. This is a completely fundamental challenge, super revisionist. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's not only the post-Cold War order, but also the post-World War II order is under the United Nations Charters. Russia ignores state integrity, respect for state sovereignty, peaceful solution of disputes, no use of force, and finally no change of border by force. Particularly, it's fundamentally after the Cold War period. So I think that Russia destroying the order that it helped initiate as a great and responsible power in the aftermath of World War II. Some Middle East guys say that, oh, we are always like that. Why you pay attention to Russia too much? Yes, it is. But difference is that Russia created international order. The creator initiated a blackout. This is a point of issue I want to say that. So the Putin's remit, probably it's very famous enlargement, NATO is a problem, America is the number one enemy. Ukraine genocide against Russians, but I do not take this point today. So if we look at what nature of post-Cold War period, it ended, I tell interglacial period. So if they are the Cold War 1.0, it's from Europe to world, but it's very famous history, European crisis, Northeast Asian frozen conflict, Asian nationalism, bloc politics, and developed between Middle East Africa and in comparison to Europe. The reason why I think that the interglacial period term, because this kind of the interwar period between Great War and World War II, this kind of the analogy, I guess. Then now, if we see that the Cold War 2.0 started, this is some kind of question I explain later. But to get the nature of current issues, we should analyze deeply the 30 years, happy years, interglacial period. So I cut 3 decades. It means that relatively stability and openness, kind of good days. It's a peaked on the 9/11. I think that the cooperation. So many partnership syndrome there. Partnership, not enemy, even not friend. Any people, any country loves the strategic partnership then. So this is happy days. But from the 2002 and 2013, this kind of difficulty happens. So cooperation, but competition started. Of course, we know well this kind of color revolutions it started, but most important crisis in 2008, it's a Kosovo independence. So it's kind of a start of the change of the post-Cold War systems. So Putin thinks that if Kosovo independence was approved, why not other republics? So Georgian will actually create republics de facto. Of course, West never recognized that. So after that, 2014, then frankly speaking, Japan did not take it seriously. United States people take it seriously. So the sanction started. But those days, even then, the Putin hesitate to show its power in the public. So he did not tell the official invasion of the Ukraine. And so Crimea, it's okay, it's a referendum, people's will, people's decision. He tried to explain these things, at least some explanation of international normal, international law theory. Of course, it's a very, very one-sided explanation. But this time, completely he ignored anything. I do not explain more because of a short time. So then we pay much attention to the nature of Cold War 2.0, what this difference is. So now it's a main target in Europe. China is what doing, the South Asians, others. This is a tricky issue. This confrontation would develop the world war level. So it's still questions, but the different things that the Cold War I, this kind of nuclear weapons very, very monopolized by two great powers. But factually, the nuclear weapons proliferation so much now. And also, the Cold War I is kind of a movement for independence. It's self-definitions. So it means that the post-colonial task is very important there, and the Soviet and the United States has managed this kind of field. But these days, most of the places are already sovereign states. They have strong, not even that strong, they have a state. It's a completely 2 points difference, nuclear proliferation and everywhere nation states. So it means that in comparison with Cold War I, the Cold War II means kind of more multipolar, more interchangeable and moving fault line, I think. Then India is a very important position. You pay attention much to Quad. Oh, India is not so good partner. I don't think so. So if you look at continental India, so recently, the last September, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit held in the Samarkand, India blocked 3 resolutions by consensus. Before that, most of the, basically, the resolution was consensus-based. No one objected. But India objected 3 resolution of the Shanghai summits. First is one belt, one way, the mission. It's against China. Second, third, it's food security and energy security. This is anti-sanction resolution. Oh, they don't say that the United States, but there are some countries broke out the food security, destroy, or the energy security. India against that. So I think India is a good balancer, like these positions. Also, we do not misunderstand Shanghai Cooperation Organization's Indian's role. So it means that this kind of the space is widened. So not non-alignment, but not neutral, but not bipolar. How this is changed, this is a topic we discussed. David Wolf said that China-Russian relations, how China do or Russia do. Tabata-san is from the economic point of view. Nakanawa-san says that kind of a Middle East or Africa impact, I think. So finally, I should say some Japanese point of view. So Japan, it's a kind of in Asia. So Southeast Asia or in South Asian countries a bit away from the sanction or the fully supporting to the sanction teams. So expectation is basically Japan to South Korea. But for the sense of the Asian peoples, African peoples, I think that they do not want to be involved so much of so-called European conflict. Japan supports the sanction against Russia. This is because not only the political the reason, but also the international norm respectful attitude. But nevertheless, we live in Asia. We neighbor Russia. So this is a kind of dilemma. So people live in Hokkaido. We have shared some fishery and resources. Of course, is the energy issue, Tabata-san will say. So how to work with neighbors, even not good neighbors, keeping our fundamental attitude against Russia. This is our huge task. Final 2 minutes. I would show this local voice is from Nemuro or the former residents of the occupied islands by Soviets. Please, just 2 minutes. Eastern Asia, Hokkaido, Nemuro City, a well-known front of the occupied islands by Soviet army at the end of World War II. Now you look at Habomai Island, just 10 kilometers off Nemuro's Nosak Cape. Habomai, 100 square kilometers, is a group name of small islands. Japan criticized Russian illegal aggression over the Japanese original territory by ignoring the neutral pact and value. Japan also claims for Etorofu, Kunashiri, Shikotan, and Habomai as northern territories. Here is Kunashiri Island, bigger and richer in nature. Almost the same landscape with Shikoku Peninsula, Japan's Kuzawa when he was 5 years old. The Soviet army occupied his island Habomai. He was forced to exit home for Nemuro to escape the Russian repression. I asked him, what do you think of the Russian invasion of Ukraine? He answers, I was shocked on TV to watch a young tiny girl crying and shouting, I don't want to die. It reminds me of my old memory 76 years ago when Russia came to us. However, thanks to the 30 years of local contact between Russian islanders and us, on the passport visa-free exchange Mikhail Gorbachev introduced, I really recognize Russian islanders as same humans, rather good guys who love drinking and dancing as me. I love them. Just I hate the brutal leaders in Moscow. So this is a complete difference. We have experienced happy 30 years integration periods. We had contact, even now we had memories. So the day before yesterday, I had a talk with American locals here. So he said that now it's worse than in the post-Cold War order. We have no contact, but we share kind of the good memories still. Therefore, I think that this kind of wisdom should create something to stop the Cold War 2.0. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iwashita. Now, Dr. Tabata, let's get into more details on the war in Ukraine. These past 9 months since the beginning of the war, there has been constant talk on the role and impact of sanctions. So what is your analysis on the issue of sanctions, and what are the Japanese perspectives on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Shinichiro Tabata. Okay. Today, I'd like to talk about the present situation concerning sanctions imposed on the Russian economy. First, I look at the Russia's economic situation. Then I will touch upon the performance of Japan's trade with Russia. So far, I have been engaged in empirical studies on the Russian economy. Today's presentation will also be based on statistical analysis. In this chart, blue bar shows the current account surplus. Its increase began in the third quarter of last year. It was caused first by the increase in export. Okay. Just point. No. This one? No.
The screen is too bright.
Okay. So it was caused first by the increase in export. Export is shown in red line due to price increase. Export peaked in the fourth quarter. In the first quarter of this year, the decrease in imports began. So that was caused by the embargo by the West. So it should be noted that in terms of quarterly amount of current account surplus, the first and the second quarter of this year hit the record. In terms of annual amount, its record was made in 2021, more than $120 billion. As for this year, the figure on this chart is only for January-September, but it already over $200 billion. We can anticipate this year to be a new record. What can we learn from this extraordinary large increase in current account surplus? There are several limits, several merits, advantage of this increase. First, the Russian authorities were able to prevent the depreciation of the ruble after its temporary crash in March. Second, the second merit is the increase in international reserves, blue line on this chart. They peaked at the beginning of this year. The third merit is that since current account surplus is statistically equal to net savings in the Russian case, they have been accumulated by the government sector. As a result, this red line showed the National Welfare Fund. That fund has increased rapidly in recent years. This figure shows the monthly performance of the federal budget of Russia. Revenues, red and blue bar, increased in March and April, but began to decrease after that. Expenditures, that is green line, began to increase in June, and they have surpassed revenues since June, implying deficits of the federal budget. Red bar showed the oil and gas revenues in federal budget revenues. It is apparent that the decrease in federal budget revenues since May were mainly caused by those in oil and gas revenues. Although Russia ceased to publish data on exports of oil and gas, they continue to publish data on their production. And these data more or less suggest a trend of exports of these fuels. Production of crude oil, blue line, and petroleum products, red line, did not decrease significantly in this year. Production of LNG, purple line, increased largely. On the contrary, production of natural gas decreased significantly. As the above argument indicates, as long as oil and gas exports from Russia continues, Russia can accumulate current account surplus and earn state budget revenues. In this connection, I made a simple and preliminary simulation calculating what will be the effect of complete stop of imports of oil and gas by the West. This table shows the structure of oil and gas exports from Russia by countries in 2021. Crude oil, petroleum products, and natural gas. In the total, almost 70% of oil and gas was exported to the West. This is the estimates for 2027, which is calculated by assuming that the West completely stop the imports of oil and gas from Russia, and the non-West increases those by 30% in comparison with 2021. Consequently, total volume of Russia's oil and gas exports will fall by 58% by 2027 in comparison with 2021. This table shows the result of the simulation. I assume that domestic consumption of oil and gas and non-oil and gas revenues will not change in this period. Then oil and gas revenues are estimated to decrease by 41%, which will cause decrease in federal budget revenues by 15%. But these assumptions that there will be no change in domestic consumption of oil and gas and non-oil and gas revenues will not decrease are very unrealistic. There will be significant decreases in them, due to the stagnation of the economy. Therefore, I think that my calculation may somewhat underestimate the effect of complete stop of imports by the West. Now, I'd like to talk about what Japan is doing in relation to the economic sanctions against Russia. This chart shows Japan's trade with Russia. Japan's imports, red line, increased in the last quarter of 2021 and remained large in the first quarter of this year. Then from March of this year, they began to decrease. With regard to Japan's export to Russia, blue line, they considerably decreased in March, right after Russia's invasion in Ukraine. This chart shows detail on Japan's exports to Russia. Automobiles have been one of the most important goods exported to Russia from Japan. Blue bar shows new cars, and red bar shows used car exports. New car exports decreased considerably in April and disappeared after May. New cars are exported by Japanese major automobile companies. They withdrew from Russia and stopped trading and business with Russia. On the contrary, used car exports continued and increased significantly after June. Now, used cars accounted for more than half of Japan's exports to Russia. Used cars are exported by medium and small companies. They seem to continue and expand their business with Russia. In Russia, demand for automobile is growing due to the sharp decline in production and imports of cars. This is a detail of Japan's imports from Russia. Most of them are accounted for by fuels such as coal, blue line, blue bar, crude oil, red bar, and LNG, green bar. From March, they began to decrease. Particularly, crude oil imports declined considerably from May. Coal imports declined in September. Prime Minister of Japan announced in April and May that Japan would stop imports of coal and crude oil from Russia. But imports of LNG have not decreased yet. The conclusion of this presentation are very simple. Since the Russian economy heavily depends on oil and gas exports, if they continue, Russia can survive and prosper. If not, it will inflict great damage to the Russian economy. I anticipate that when the West will completely cut imports of oil and gas from Russia, as they declared, then the damage to the Russian economy would be much larger. There is still ample room for reducing oil and gas imports from Russia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Tabata. Now, Dr. Naganawa, so far we've heard about the big picture view, the viewpoints from Japan, but now let's shift the perspective a little bit. Could you share with us what Moscow's thinking is with regards to the importance of Russia's relationship with another important player, Saudi Arabia?
Well, yeah. Thanks so much. Thank you, Kaori, for kind introduction. And so, yeah, my view is from a different East. We're talking about Eurasia from East, but from the different East, from the Middle East. And I'll talk about Russia's unlikely alliance with Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, I'm not an energy specialist, so my focus will be on Islam and geopolitics of anti-Westernism. But my talk will provide you a completely different picture, different from the seminar about Saudi Arabian oil hosted by the Middle Eastern program at Kennan Institute last week. On February 11th, 2007, Vladimir Putin landed at King Khalid Airport in Saudi Arabia. This is the first visit of the head of the Russian state to the kingdom. The timing was crucial. The day before his visit to Riyadh, Vladimir Putin gave a famous speech in Munich, Germany, denouncing the US unipolar world order and the NATO's progression to Russia's borders against the backdrop of the color revolution in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. Implicit in this timing is that Putin's visit to Saudi Arabia was part of Russia's larger endeavor to establish another pole in global politics. While the US devastated Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria through humanitarian interventions, Russia continued to cultivate firm bilateral relations with the countries in the Middle East. As a result, Russia today seems to have no enemies in the region, mediating conflicts over Syria and maintaining good relations with both Iran and Saudi Arabia without raising much tension between the two regional powers. Russian commentators usually see this situation as Russia's return to the region after the failed Soviet engagement during the Cold War. In fact, Russian-Saudi relations began when the Bolsheviks embraced the vision setting Soviet Russia as an emancipator of the East against British imperialism. As a matter of fact, in February 1926, the Soviet Union became the first country that recognized the founder of Saudi Arabia, Abdulaziz ibn Saud. Even the Middle Eastern specialists also forget that Russia was the very first country that recognized the Saudi Arabia. And by the end of the 1925, Ibn Saud had defeated the ruler of Mecca, Hussein al-Hashimi, a former ally of Thomas Edward Lawrence. So it means that the Soviets had their own Lawrence of Arabia. His name was Karim Hakimov, a Tatar originally from Bashkiria. Reader William Bullard, a British consul in Jeddah, the entrance to Mecca, apparently saw a parallel between Lawrence and Hakimov. The British consul reported in May 1925, quote, Hakimov tried to enlist Ibn Saud in the Soviet Union's scheme for a great revolt of the East against the imperialistic and colonizing powers, unquote. Here, I would like to emphasize that history does matter in contrast to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and the US, which emerged as a marriage of convenience based on oil after the meeting of Franklin Roosevelt and Ibn Saud on the Suez Canal only in 1945. In addition, history reveals persistent patterns in interactions between Russia and Saudi Arabia, which remains even relevant today. As Eileen Kane, in her influential book on Russian Hajj, forcefully shows, a significant feature of Russia's involvement in the Middle East is the intimate linkage of imperial integration of the Muslim subjects and expansion to Muslim neighbors abroad. Here, we can observe a similar dynamism. First of all, the Soviet representatives to Jeddah, the Hijaz, Saudi Arabia, were Muslim Bolsheviks who had been deeply involved in the party politics in Turkestan, Central Asia. The first Soviet representative to the Hijaz, to Saudi Arabia, Karim Hakimov, had occupied high positions in Tashkent and Bukhara. The second representative was Nazir Turakulov. He's a Kazakh, and he used to work in Tashkent with Hakimov for Communist Party of Turkestan. And second, the Soviet diplomats in the 1920s, like their Tsarist counterparts, attached a substantial importance to the Hajj, listening to the grievances of the pilgrims, those former Russian subjects living in the Hijaz. By doing so, the Bolsheviks tried to expand their message of anti-imperialism. For the young Saudi state, too, the Hajj was important not only as a potential leverage with which to demonstrate Ibn Saud as the new protector of the Mecca, the Hajj was actually the most important source of revenue for the Saudis before the discovery of oil in 1938. their shared interests were clearly embodied by the Congress of Muslim World, which the Saudis assembled in Mecca in June 1926. By inviting Soviet delegates to the Congress, Ibn Saud established himself as a new protector of Mecca and Medina, and thereby Ibn Saud amplified British paranoia of global Muslim unity in collusion with the Bolsheviks. The Soviet Union, in its turn, dispatched a delegation with 8 distinguished Islamic scholars. This was the second largest delegation after that of India. Here, we should note that the year of 1926 was the last moment for anti-imperialism to make possible a symbiosis of the atheist regime, domestic Islamic scholars, and Wahhabis in Arabia. In addition to the Hajj, the Soviet diplomats were enthusiastic about expanding Soviet commercial presence in the Red Sea. The major exports from the Soviet Union were kerosene, benzene, flour, sugar, matches, timber, and manufactured goods. Meanwhile, Ibn Saud behaved carefree so as not to irritate the British too much, because his country neighbored the British Mandate territories, and his economy substantially depended on merchants from British India. In the course of negotiation with the Soviets, the Saudis pressed for impossible conditions, the increase of pilgrims and the constant flow of profits to Mecca and Medina generated by the pious endowments in the former territory of the Russian Empire. Simultaneously, the Saudis attempted to obtain long-term credit from the Soviet Union, and the Saudis simultaneously tried to get compensation from the British for the loss caused by the prohibitive measures against the Soviet products. In short, Ibn Saud artfully played the Soviets off against the British to maximize their own profits. So this pattern is actually repeated today, in the, particularly among Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the U.S. And the Soviet-Saudi relations stopped in 1938. But during the Cold War, the Soviets sent almost annually 20 to 25 pilgrims to Mecca, used these delegations as a showcase for freedom of conscience and reconciliation of progress and piety. The year of 1979 was the turning point, with the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the Soviet invasion to Afghanistan. Competing with Iran for supremacy in the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia sent out to Afghanistan the so-called Mujahideens, holy warriors, including Osama bin Laden. These fighters consequently devastated the Soviet Union as a champion of anti-imperialism, and the Saudis' ambition continued even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And 1 year before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the diplomatic relations between the two countries began once again, and using this opportunity, a number of Saudis charitable organizations penetrated into Russia's Muslim regions to invigorate the Islamic revival. And even these charitable organizations supported the Islamic militants, particularly in Chechnya and North Caucasus. And meanwhile, Saudis denounced Russia as an inhumane aggressor to the Chechen people. The 9/11 convinced the U.S. of Saudi Arabia becoming a major sponsor of global Islamic radicalism. So instead of Saudi Arabia, the U.S. tried to convert Saddam Hussein's Iraq into a secular democratic ally in the Middle East. And we know this ended with a complete disaster. Russia was against the war in Iraq, expressing its solidarity with the Muslim world, with the help of domestic Muslim leaders. Talgat Tajuddin, Mufti, the spiritual leader of Islam in Russia, even declared jihad against the United States of America. The Iraq War paved the way for rapprochement between Russia and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis' active support enabled Russia to become observer of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in 2005. The Saudis, meanwhile, were interested in avoiding too much dependence on the US, inviting Russia's involvement in the peaceful nuclear energy and military technology. Putin's visit to Riyadh in 2007 was a very significant moment when the two largest energy providers in the world attempted to convert rapprochement into a strategic cooperation. But here again, Saudis have behaved carefully so as not to irritate the Americans too much. Riyadh never fulfilled promises of huge investments in the Russian economy. Saudis and Russians talk much. There are a lot of things to negotiate, but Saudis have not. They do not have a will to realize all these promises. And Putin's visit was returned after 10 years when King Salman, another son of Ibn Saud, visited Moscow in October 2017. This happened in a different geopolitical reality after the annexation of Crimea and Russia's military intervention in Syria. King Salman met Russia's Islamic leaders too, including Crimean Mufti, Crimean Islamic leader, and they exchanged ideas concerning countermeasures against religious extremism. And we should not forget that Hajj remains an important occasion reinforcing both the integration of the Muslim citizens and the friendship with Saudi Arabia. Since Saudi Arabia annually allocates a quota of pilgrims to each Muslim country, so every Muslim cannot go to Saudi Arabia freely because Saudi Arabia allocated the quote. 1,000 pilgrims per million Muslims. And Russia had actually a quote of 25,000 at maximum before COVID-19. So Russia every year sent its special mission to Saudi Arabia to coordinate logistical details of the Hajj. So this means that Russia constantly have a channel to negotiate with the Saudis. In addition, after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Saudi Arabia agreed with Russia to transfer a Hajj quota of Crimea from Ukraine to Russia. This means that Saudi Arabia indirectly recognized the annexation of Crimea. So that's why Saudi decided to transfer the Hajj quota from Ukraine to Russia. And actually, in all spheres of Hajj enterprise, Muslim representatives continue to play a pivotal role, and about which, of course, I don't have time, and about which actually I published an article in the journal Religion, State, and Society in 2019. And just briefly, of course, the head of the Muslim regions also used the Hajj to reinforce their own image as a pious, benevolent leaders. And as you see, this is a picture of President, head of the Tatarstan, Rustam Minnihanov. Of course, as you see there, on the one hand, he wear religious attire to perform religious rituals, but on the other hand, switch to the business suit to negotiate with the Saudis. To conclude, I want to note that Putin's Russia identifies the Arab Spring and its disastrous aftermath with its own humiliated trajectory of the demise of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, a series of color revolutions, the Georgian War, and the Ukrainian crisis, as Professor Iwashita mentioned. So in other words, Putin's Russia was retaliating for the past humiliations, claiming the Crimea and returning to the Middle East by means of the Syrian war. By doing so, Russia has tried to make Russia great again on the international arena. And the Ukrainian war this year reveals an elusive but increasingly strong alliance between the two oil giants in controlling energy price in the global market. In addition, Mohammed bin Salman's personal involvement in prisoners of war swap, along with Turkey, at the end of September, suggests that Saudi Arabia is trying to be a significant player of international politics using the Ukrainian war. More broadly, I would contend that regional powers such as Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia are now moving beyond the region, that is the Middle East, by using the Ukrainian war against the backdrop of the U.S. withdrawal of commitments to the Middle East. Of course, I should add that Russia has very few economic and military resources to provide for Saudi Arabia, in comparison with the U.S. as the Saudi's strategic partner. But now, Russia and Saudi Arabia share a lot to be discussed beside oil. Relationship with Iran and civil wars in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, and they were now talking about about the war in Ukraine. This September, Saudi Arabia received partnership for dialogue in Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Mohammed bin Salman told Vladimir Putin that the kingdom was ready to be an active participant in SCO's activity. And at the same time, Iran received full membership of SCO. Just as the Soviet-Saudi relations began as an alliance against British imperialism, the Russian-Saudi relations today also worked as a compelling challenge to the Western-centric world order. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So lastly, I think there's one more crucial player we need to keep in mind when talking about this war, and that is Beijing's point of view. Dr. Wolf, how do you see the evolution of China's behavior vis-a-vis Russia? On February 4, right before the war, China and Russia issued a joint statement really strengthening and supporting their strong friendship. And how has that changed, if at all, and how do you see the future of Russia-China relations as we get further into the war? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Romay, for that introduction, and thank you all for coming today to hear our presentations from the other side of the world. Following Professor Naganawa, I would certainly agree that providing historical background shows what deep roots contemporary relations can quickly set down into historical soil that is present. So if I was going to give you a long Russia-China story, I would cite dates such as 1689, 1727, 1860, 1917, 1946, 1950, 1969, and there'll be a quiz later on these dates. Or you can ask me and I'll tell you why. Each one of those represents a real first for Russia and China in their relationship. They're dates that Russians who do China and Chinese who do Russia know, and they know that these are the dates that make Russia China's most significant other and vice versa. But today I'm going to spare you and take my historian's hat off and talk instead about something more contemporary and speak specifically to the Ukraine issue. What I'm going to provide is an explication de texte, a close textual analysis of the transcript of Putin's meeting with the Valdai discussion group, which took place on October 27th, which is just less than 3 weeks ago, so very contemporary. So the Valdai discussion group, as most of you probably know, it's a think tank that's located in Moscow. It's very close to Putin. It hosts a yearly conference of experts, which includes a couple delegates from many countries around the world, very varied scene. Since the war in Ukraine and the sanctions and the boycotts began against Russian aggression, no or almost no representatives from unfriendly countries. So a kind of a pared down version of the Valdai experts group. In our group here, it's only Professor Iwashita who has had the honor of actually taking part in this, unless there's someone else in the, oh, Harley has also. Oh, yes, it is an honor. And it certainly was an honor at the time. Right. So, so every year, after several days of discussions at the Valdai conference, Putin comes and he answers questions from the audience. This year it took place on October 27th. And Putin is always on the ball for this. You know, he's really kind of prepared. He's never off the cuff. He makes a statement and then he answers the questions. The moderator is also always on the ball, not as on the ball as Dr. Romay, but still pretty much on the ball. And one often gets a sense that the questions have been, they're softballs. They've been prepared in advance so that Putin can provide the information he wants to provide. And this year was no different. The transcript goes up quickly on the Kremlin website, is usually available in both Russian and in English pretty quickly. At this year's meeting with Putin, despite the fact that it was not mentioned in the Washington Post on it, there was nothing more salient than Putin's discussion of Sino-Russian relations, highlighting some important truths about the relationship and some likely falsehoods as well. Of course, catching Putin out in falsehoods, it's like, the 10,000 fact checks against Trump statements, it's sort of, it's kind of too easy. It's shooting fish in the barrel. Right. So within minutes of taking the stage, Putin called out the West, whose divided, degraded nature he decried for stoking of war in Ukraine and provocations against Taiwan. That was the pairing, right? China would be mentioned again and again, more than any other country. Xi Jinping took top billing, being called a friend, not once but twice. Chinese guests were called on twice for their questions. Otherwise, only Russians got in more than one question. So whatever symbolic relevance you would attach to that. When asked by a Chinese professor for comments on the last recent years of the Russian-Chinese relationship, Putin treated it in greater detail than any other bilateral. And here are a few selected citations. We cooperate in all spheres. I don't do a good Putin accent. I should work on this. China is our biggest trade and economic partner, with trade growing even before sanctions began. We are conducting regular military exercises. In military technology, we have enjoyed a level of trust previously unseen in the history of our two countries. His highest praise was reserved for the Chinese president / chairman / general secretary, Xi Jinping, depending which one of his hats he's wearing. My friend Xi Jinping and I, he has called me his friend, and I consider him as such. When asked about strategies for developing basic science in Russia, a question from a representative of Rosatom, the Russian nuclear agency, Putin instead praised Xi Jinping's leadership on Chinese science, on the Chinese economy, and for improving the well-being of the Chinese people. Somewhat non sequiturs, absolutely fulsome. Nothing really new here. In May 2021, I gave a talk at the Kennan where I described the economic, military, and leadership level cooperations between Russia and China. Probably the YouTube is still up on the Kennan site. And Valdai, comments at Valdai this year simply confirmed the state of play that I described a little more than a year ago. But there was some new information to be teased from the transcript, specifically regarding the Putin-Xi relationship. When Putin mocked French President Emmanuel Macron, who tried hard to prevent the war in Ukraine and then condemned Putin for it roundly, he told how Macron had violated the norms of top leader symmetry by allowing their phone call to be heard on a speakerphone, a conversation that then became public. Putin said that making details from conversations public should only happen by agreement between the two leaders in a summit. In contrast, in 39 Putin-Xi summits, the most either has held with a counterpart, there have been 0 leaks. Maybe someone will contradict me, but to the best of my knowledge, 0 leaks, very impressive. These are face-to-face meetings. They seem to trust most face-to-face meetings, and they did it very regularly until COVID. Putin then took a question from the session's moderator, Fyodor Lukyanov, who asked him specifically if he had told Xi Jinping in advance of his plan to invade Ukraine. Putin denied it, and also denied that Xi Jinping had been upset at being blindsided, although they had met less than 3 weeks before Putin invaded. The Russian troops had already been fully mobilized, and the Chinese president had been briefed on Russian readiness for war by American officials coming to Beijing using the available satellite data, pleading in vain for Chinese intervention with his good friend Vladimir Putin. So Xi knew about it, and Putin knew that Xi knew about it, but he says he never said anything to him. And he went on the record saying that. Indeed, it will be remembered that when Putin attended the 2022 Olympic opening ceremony in Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry press release on February 4, 2022, so 20 days before the invasion, stated that the talks took place in a warm and friendly atmosphere and that the two presidents had an in-depth exchange of views on the current international and regional situation and major hotspot issues of mutual interest. They concluded that the two sides needed to engage in even closer cooperation and collaboration in international affairs. No mention of Ukraine was made in the Foreign Ministry statement. But certainly, the main hotspot at that moment was Ukraine, and China would soon support Russia both economically and diplomatically with increased trade to cover losses due to Western sanctions, so nicely described by Professor Tabata, although he makes it clear that, that there's no way for the shift to the east to make up for what's being lost to the west. There's just no way. And Xi Jinping would also prevent UN action and Russian isolation by abstaining in key UN votes. So I doubt Putin's disclaimer. But aside from my doubts, I can't prove that he said or he didn't say. It's interesting that Putin's disclaimer is no less a revelation of summit contents, that according to Putin's own rules as expressed regarding Macron, would have had to have been cleared with Xi Jinping before he said what was discussed or what was not discussed. And it is hard to imagine that coordination on the hotspot is not a more or less clear warning that military action would soon begin. However Putin might have phrased it. Maybe it was just something like, I can show you how one can take care of a difficult province. And begin it did, as soon as the Olympics ended, a coordination of timing that seems unlikely to be purely coincidental. Recent history suggests similar dissimulations. For example, Xi Jinping was present at the Sochi Olympics in 2014, 3 weeks before the occupation of Crimea and the Donbass areas, and the Chinese press statement at that time specifically said they exchanged views on the situation in Ukraine, the Korean Peninsula, and other issues. Would Xi have really appreciated being blindsided on Putin's violation of his borders with Ukraine when China would be called upon to step up trade to counter sanctions and use its abstention at the UN to register support for Putin? This seems unlikely, and the two Olympic side meetings in 2014 and again in 2022 suggest collusion at the highest level, although we do not know what Putin actually revealed and in what detail. I have a couple more examples, but I'll trot them out if I'm asked. But I know my time is pressing. So Putin is helping to distance Xi from events in Eastern Europe in accordance with a division of labor that could be implicit but is more likely to have been explicit at some point at some level. Both Russia and China have stopped reporting many international trade statistics, as Professor Tabata pointed out, in order to hide the degree and kind of Chinese support. Although The Economist is often able to suss out using other parallel data, such as the production data instead of the export data. When Putin and Xi met most recently in Samarkand on September 15th, 2 months ago, there was much optimistic speculation in the Western press regarding disagreements, especially since China made no mention of Ukraine. But immediately on his return to Moscow, Putin escalated conflict by conducting a significant mobilization of additional Russian troops and annexing the 4 provinces he had occupied. Again, either a blindside or a coordination. Of course, this could be taken as a step towards the endgame, but Putin's calculations have proven faulty several times already. Again, China abstained at the UN. Would Putin have taken these increasingly provocative actions if China had cautioned him at Samarkand? Does Putin not implicate China by taking significant military steps shortly after meeting with Xi? It is a kind of rhetorical entrapment, hinting at China's shared responsibility for the sorrow of war visited directly on tens of millions and indirectly on billions. But Putin has hinted at deeper entrapments as well. For example, in June 2019, at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, Putin described his position in the US-China trade war as "smart monkey watches the tigers fight in the valley." Would he not be content to see Xi Jinping join the battle against the common enemy by retaking the renegade province filled with compatriots? It is not hard to imagine Xi Jinping might have gone in that direction already had Putin romped to victory in Ukraine in a matter of days. In his speech at Valdai, Putin was filled with indignation on China's behalf, describing Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan as crazy, meant to antagonize China even as the U.S. is embroiled in conflict with Russia. He also called it a provocation, maybe hoping that China would feel provoked. In fact, convincing China to enter a conflict in East Asia could well deflect Western material support from Ukraine. Admiral Philip Davidson's recent testimony to Congress, naming the next 6 years as the most dangerous period for Taiwan, has highlighted China's possible view that annexation must take place before a defensive weapons stockpile analogous to that used by Ukraine to fend off Russia can be built up in Taiwan. The PRC is also aware of U.S. self-doubts regarding U.S. armed forces' ability to conduct 2 major regional contingencies, a core tenet for the past 30 years of American military policy. War in Taiwan would make Japan the rear, analogous to Poland for Ukraine. If U.S. forces became active, it would lead almost immediately to the dispersal of American forces from their bases in Japan to all over the archipelago, making every airport, harbor, and railway hub of Japan into a Chinese missile target. In addition to rhetorical encouragement, are there ways in which Putin can encourage China down this slippery slope? Angela Stent has written of Putin's judo style of using other strengths against them. Might sales of certain weapons system embolden China? The stockpiling of strategic reserves of raw materials, especially petroleum products from Russia, which is now going on, might be construed as a pre-war preparation, but it also might be just one of the few ways in which China can aid Russia without drawing sanctions upon itself. But both Putin and Xi realize that their tenure at the helm of a great partnership and their resolve to end Western hegemony, as they call it, can only be sustained for the next 10 years or so while they remain capable of active rule. In his Valdai speech, Putin stated, "We are at a historic crossroads. We are in for probably the most dangerous, unpredictable, and at the same time, most important decade since the end of World War II. Exactly how fraught that decade will be depends in large part on how well China and Russia can manage their division of labor as challengers to the status quo." Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for these 4 excellent presentations. We have a little less than 20 minutes left, so I'd like to jump straight into Q&A, if possible, with the audience, both the in-person audience and the virtual one. If you're in person, please raise your hand and then state your name and affiliation. I'd like to remind the virtual attendees that if you have a question, you can submit it via email to cannon@wilsoncenter.org or via Twitter at Cannon Institute or on the Institute's Facebook page. And also please include your name and affiliation. All right, so maybe we already have 3 questions. I think I saw this one first, please.
Thank you. I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. And David, you make a very compelling case for the Putin-Xi partnership functioning. On the other hand, we know from the chief Nikkei expert on China that the whole standing committee vanished for a week after the 24th of February. And there were some rumors that were talking about collective leadership. Maybe more significant, right after he spent a long time with the American Secretary of State, Deputy Foreign Minister Li, who was the only deputy minister in the Central Committee of the Chinese Party, was moved from Foreign Ministry, where people thought he might be the next minister, to radio and television. That looked like a downgrade. We can talk about investment later. No more loans for Russia from BRI or Asian Investment Bank. How solid is this, or are they putting on a good act?
Maybe we can collect all 3 of them first. I'm sorry, I saw this one. This hand first.
So thank you very much for your presentation. So first one so I have 2 questions, but they'll both be brief. For Professor Iwashita, from your discussions with people in the Northern Territories, was there any sense that the worse this war goes for Russia, and the fact that Ukraine has also recognized that the territories are under occupation, that there might be any chance of territorial revision at any point under any circumstances in the future, broadly understood? And for Professor Tabata, the data that you presented, and really the story that you presented, is Russia decouples from the West. So that's like the broad picture there. Does this suggest, and I've read a number of your papers on trying to understand the Soviet economy through basically indirect statistics, so I like that this is coming back to reality. But my question is, when you provide those data, the decrease of imports, particularly semiconductors, all the things that are necessary for a modern economy, and it's just oil and gas export, other commodities, does this suggest that Russia's future, as you see it, is going backwards in terms of technological development and is going to be just part of thinking about maybe core and periphery type economies, that it's going to be just a core periphery economy that it provides commodities, little else? And that's what basically it'll serve. Thank you.
All right, one more.
Thank you very much. I'm Marcia McGraw-Olive of Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Wilson Center. I think this was a fabulous presentation overall and beautifully coordinated. I have recently looked at the Central Bank of Russia's medium-term projections, And they have a global crisis case in which there would be sharp collapse of consumption for households in Russia. And what the bottom line of all this is oil and the oil price. And they're projecting $40 a barrel Urals in their crisis case. So the question I have for all of you is to connect this oil story, because it really does hinge, besides the technological point, that which, of course, the central bank says they have a rosy scenario if they can reconnect supply chains for the sort of points that Professor Weber was mentioning. But my question is whether the Saudi and Russian decision to curtail production and the ability for the Chinese to be buying Russian oil, heavily discounted, if you look at the price effects of the oil market, can we still foresee the fiscal crisis that you are projecting? Thank you.
All right, maybe David, would you like to take the first one?
Right. So first of all, I wanted to thank you for that very kind remark about the whole panel. Sorry. And that shouldn't go to us. That actually should go to Will Pomerantz, who invited us, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and especially to Victoria Pardini, who made this all happen, all the nuts and bolts. Thank you so much. I guess, you know, Harley is my doubter. I understand. He's expressed himself in print with these doubts, and so I understand that. And, you know, I basically agree with you, Harley, that there's real limits to what they can do. And you've really pointed that out, you know, both in your presentations and in your articles, real limits to what they can do. But I think that rather than saying that they're reaching disagreements, I think I point at what I call a division of labor. I think it's crucial for the Chinese to avoid sanctions as long as possible to keep their economy as functional as possible. That's where they can really help Putin at this point, by keeping their economy strong. You know, just in the way that Zelensky came into all that, you know, came into hot water when they started, when it came out that he really knew that there was going to be war months in advance, but he didn't reveal it to the Ukrainian populace because he wanted to keep the economy going for at least a few more months rather than having everybody panic and run for the doors, right? And lose billions and billions of dollars more over that and have a dysfunctional situation when it came, right? So in the same way, I think they really have to try to avoid the sanctions. They have to do this kind of dissimulation, and I'm trying to point out places where their dissimulations become quite obvious and where you can see the game being played. And that's what my goal was today. But I completely agree with you that there's limits to what China can do, and I think Professor Tabata's economic arguments also make it clear there's just so much you can do. There's a limit to what you can do turning to the east. And I think he's presenting an upside, almost like a most optimistic version of what could happen. I think indeed China really just can't make up for that European market. So let me let my colleagues take on the rest of the questions.
Yes, Dr. Iwashita, Dr. Tabata, if you'd like to tackle the second
Thank you
and third
for the
questions.
question. Another territory issues for me. So I just before brief the Canon cable number 60. So they are bested by Russia. Abes failed northern territory negotiations. I wrote this is a digest of my paper in. I put the kind of fiasco of the Abe's foreign policy toward northern territories. So the Abe Shinzo is a very great guy. He's very human, but he tried to his best to solve the issue, to get the peace treaty. But I agree with David. Putin is a liar in the context of Japan. So frankly speaking, I would say then our negotiations faulted. So the Putin managed well. So in this sense, before COVID-19, the negotiations always dead, stacked. Regardless COVID-19, no progress. It means that regardless of Russian invasion of Ukraine, no progress. This is a different matter. But important thing that I highlighted, now the stop human touch exchanges Mikhail Gorbachev created early 90s in this happy 30 years. So even we have the territorial disputes, the local peoples have access mutually, not free, but they can back and forth, particularly informal islanders, easily get islands they lived once. So, but they are now, or any contact stopped. Russia breakdown system broke out Mikhail Gorbachev legacy at all. So in this sense, the average of former resident Japanese, 87. I think that this fault line continues more than 5 years, 10 years, then, so all of them would pass away. So this is a very tragedy. This is a more deep impact rather than just territorial disputes. This is a new fact. Thank you.
Today I mostly talk about oil and gas, but I think embargo of exports of high-tech technology products is more critical to the Russian economy. So I also think that the Russian economy will be in the future, in the Russian economy will be more primitive economy based on the how to say resources other than oil and gas and something like that. But since the sanctions related to Crimean annexation since 2014.
For countries, a big buyer, the most hugest buyer of the weapons. But I think that in that sense too, the appeal of the Russian weapon is now losing. So in that sense, it seems to me that the only Saudis gaining much more political leverage and more benefits than Russia from this alliance between two countries.
I don't see any questions here from the audience, but we do have a question from a virtual attendee, and it's a question for Dr. Naganawa. I'm sorry, you have to speak again, back to back. But what is Russia's view of Islam internally as they crack down on religious freedom and its views of human rights? And this comes from David Morado, DoD Strategic Plan.
I should I should emphasize that the Russia in this sense doing quite well, and Russia has a long history of coexistence with with Muslims. Of course, we know a lot about the Chechen wars and the exodus of Muslims from the Caucasus and the Crimea and deportations of a lot of Muslim peoples in the Stalin era. We know a lot of strategies, and I don't mean that to deny all the things, but particularly Putin's Russia succeeded in integrating all the Muslim leaders, and it is in the Putin period that all the infrastructure of the religious life is quite really brought into order, and the Russian government is very well worked with Muslim leaders and Muslim authorities, Muslim institutions, and so the Muslim leaders also quite supported. Of course, they do not have an alternative but to say that they're supporting the war. But I think that. This integration works very well, and it is but this coordination works as opposed to so-called Wahhabism. So of course, in the as I explained, the Saudi charitable organization supported the kind of fundamentalist radicals in the 1990s, particularly in the North Caucasus. But Russia themselves, and together with Muslim leaders, they elaborated their own ideology of Islam. They called traditional Islam that facilitated the coexistence with Russia for a long century. So I think that in that sense, this management works quite well.
Thank you, Professor. We are out of time, actually, so I would like to thank all the panelists and the co-hosts, the Wilson Center, as well as the Slavic Eurasian Research Center at Hokkaido University. Thank you so much for your great presentations. I personally learned a lot from your materials and from your presentations today, so I'm really excited. Thank you everyone who joined today, and thanks to our audience, virtual audience as well. So please visit our website, wilsoncenter.org, if you'd like to stay up to date with our events. We hope to see you at the Wilson Center's next event. Please join me for a round of applause for the panelists.